Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break.
Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Ben Powers, Commander from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Miss Stacy Hayashi. She's coming at us from Oahu, Hawaii, and we're going to be talking about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Japanese-American contribution to victory in the Second World War. So good morning, ma'am. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, we're really excited to have you on and have you talk about it. I think you're like the third woman guest we've had on the show, and it'll be 29 episodes. So I'm really happy to kind of fix the balance a little bit here. And I'm really excited to talk about the 442nd because I've been interested in them since I was, a teenager and studying World War II history, but they don't get as much recognition as, again, I always default back to everybody gets excited about the 101st and the Band of Brothers because of the, Saving Private Ryan and the Band of Brothers miniseries. And you've done a lot of work to kind of address that issue and bring the 442nd into a more public light. So we're going to explore that today, but for folks who are watching or listening who may not know the story of the 100th Battalion or the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, could you give a quick overview of their history?
Sure, yeah, and so it's a very ironic story, actually. So in Hawaii, the 100th and the 442 started in Hawaii, and we were the ones who were attacked on December 7th by Japan. So most people don't know that almost half the population in Hawaii was Japanese or Japanese American. So it was like 25,000 Japanese immigrants came over to Hawaii to work on sugar plantations in the late 1800s. And their children, of course, were American. And so these are the people who, had come of age and were in the service on December 7th, defending Hawaii from attack, and so here's the enemy and they look like them, right? So like I'm also Japanese American. I'm a fourth generation. We call that Yonsei. But the 100th 442, they're the most highly decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and time in combat. And people don't know who they are, and it's a very it's sad people don't know who they are. I mean, U.S. Senator Danny Noy, he lost his arm in combat in Italy, and he has a Medal of Honor, and he's, he represented Hawaii for over 50 years. He was the first Japanese American elected to U.S. Congress, and then and then the U.S. Senate, and he represented us for over 50 years. Sparky Matsunaga was with the 100th Battalion, and then even U.S. Senator Dan Akaka, he was Native Hawaiian, and he was a World War II veteran as well. So Hawaii's got a huge history. Especially since we're the only battlefield in the U.S. We were the only ones who were attacked.
Yes, ma'am. And it makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of interesting as you go into it, literally day one from the conflict with Japan, you had Japanese Americans helping defend the island. You had members of, the University of Hawaii ROTC were mobilized as part of was it the Hawaii Home Guard? What was the proper term?
Hawaii Territorial Guard. So back then Hawaii wasn't a state yet. So we were a territory. So it was the Territorial Guard. But we also had a National Guard, and that was actually federalized in 1940, and they became U.S. Army. So they were 25th Infantry Division. So know them as the Tropic Lightning, the Electric Strawberry guys. They're in the Army, the Army-Navy game. Yes, so that uniform is really cool. But yeah, so a lot of these, so the guys who became the original 100 Battalion were in the 298th Infantry on December 7th.
And were they were mobilized or they were already serving? December 7th happens. They are, being assigned positions, guarding beaches. That people are very worried about a follow-up attack after the initial Japanese strike. How many weeks went by, and when things started to basically calm down and folks started to become more suspicious of these soldiers and decide that they shouldn't be bearing arms anymore?
Oh, it was right away, actually. And so, we were attacked, and then it was chaotic, of course. But like even that night, and so you saw in the film that I made, Go for Broke, an origin story. So it was really hurtful, and also it's in the comic book that I wrote about them. So the movie that I made, Go for Broke, an origin story, is the origin story of the 100 Battalion 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Military Intelligence Service, and how it all started in Hawaii. And And so there's a Hawaiian soldier who was friends, you know, I mean, they grew up together, they played together, they trained together. And yet here you have, you know, Hawaii is attacked by Japan. And then these people who were, you thought you were your friends, you know, they're suspecting you. They're like, oh, I mean, so the Hawaiian guy is like, oh, who are you going to shoot? You know, so the Japanese guy is like, who you think, stupid, you know, me just as good American as you. So, I mean, that's, so I call it the urban myth, you know, of the 100th Battalion, because that's actually the story that they tell. Like, that's the question: who are you going to shoot? You know, it's in pidgin English, and so Ted Tsukiyama, who is in the movie, he was second in command of the Varsity Victory Volunteers, who were the Hawaii Territorial Guard, activate the UH-ROTC activated on December 7th, and then they were 6 weeks later they were kicked out. All the Japanese guys were kicked out. But, you know, so Ted kind of served as their historian and actually as a historian for pretty much all the units, you know, and he was in most of them. So there was the HTG, the Hawaii Territorial Guard, the Varsity Victory Volunteers, the 442nd, and Military Intelligence Service. And so he was with those 4 units. And actually even he was with like 7 units, like, you know, with the MIS, he was with the Air Force, and they were like, he said eavesdropping, you know, on like Japan, they were, you know, they were wiretapping.
Yes, ma'am.
In Burma. But so, you know, the other 2 units were the 100th Battalion, and also the 1399. They were construction engineers, and so most people don't know about them because they never left Hawaii. But, you know, a lot of the work that they did was very secret. They dug tunnels and they built water, you know, the water tower in Wahiawa, you know, so stuff like that. But yeah, so it is a very ironic story. A lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't know it. So.
Well, and that's really cool. You bring up the Varsity Victory Volunteers and the 1399th, because those are 2 units I had never heard of, or organizations, because the Varsity Victory Volunteers, they were obviously civilians. They were removed from the Territorial Guard, and they were deciding, well, what are we going to do now? So there was this group of, you know, educated young men who wanted to serve, and they banded together to volunteer their services in any capacity. And they became basically almost among other missions, they became a labor organization. Is that not correct?
Yes, that's exactly correct. And it was and so I think what might be lost on people who are watching the film and don't know about, you know, like immigrants, right? I mean, to be a student at the university, for one thing, you know, your parents had to really sacrifice, you know, I mean, because and so to give up those studies, that was actually a really big deal. And that's why that scene with Hung Wai Ching, you know, who told them, he was like, well, you guys got kicked out, so now what are you going to do? You're behind the 8 ball. You got to do something, right? Yeah. And so Ted would say, you got to show your colors. And so they, you know, he was like, well, you can do manual labor. And they're like, what? You know, because, you know, their parents had worked so hard to get off the plantation and, you know, the manual labor part to send them to the university. So to give that up was just really, it was, you know, of course it was insulting, but it's like, well, whatever, like whatever it took, they were going to do it. And so the VVV, or the Triple V, they became the forerunner, really. They were the precursor to the 442. So without them and the original 100 Battalion, who was breaking all these training records at in Wisconsin at Camp McCoy, you know, there would be no 442, you know. And without, you know, the people, of course, who are not Japanese or Japanese American behind the scenes, they were supporting them, you know, Hung Wai Ching for one, Shigeo Yoshida, Bob Shivers, who was the head of the FBI in Hawaii, you know. So there was a large group of people, well, actually I shouldn't say that. It was actually a very small group of people who were supporting the Japanese and the Japanese Americans. And
yes,
and that's actually what prevented the, you know, the mass. So like on the US West Coast, right? There was a whole Japanese internment. They incarcerated over 120,000 Americans and immigrants. You know, I mean, most of them were Americans, and they called and they said, they were like, oh, you know, you're an enemy alien, and we're gonna stick you in, you know, you're gonna have to bring only what you can carry. And so that was a terrible, you know, human rights debacle or a civil rights debacle. But that didn't happen in Hawaii because because of people like Hong Wai-ching and Shigeo Yoshida and Robert Shivers and, the military general, Julius Emmons. Yeah.
Oh, yes, ma'am. So while these folks on the West Coast were being, put into, literal concentration camps, euphemistically call them relocation camps or resettlement, but basically a concentration camp in the broader sense of the term, you have the soldiers in the 100th Battalion. They've moved from Hawaii onto the mainland. They're training at Camp McCoy. Were there not Japanese American citizens actually incarcerated at McCoy while these soldiers were still training?
Yes. So they actually had moved them out to make room for the 100. But it was and it was so insulting. So like in the movie, right, they're prisoners. So like before December 7th, the FBI they called it the ABC list. And so they would go, there was a list of like, community leaders, the Japanese school, and anybody who like in the media, right, if they had a Japanese newspaper, or they taught martial arts, or they were businessmen. So they were, leaders in the community. And so they investigated them, to see if they would be like where their loyalties lay. And so, they would, and so that was in the movie as well. Like John Burns was also part of that effort. And so they would just go down this list and they're like, okay, what about this guy? Oh, he's a damn fine American. They would cross him off, So there were, like 300 people that they could not, definitely say without a doubt, what was going on. And so it was very unfortunate for these people because they didn't do anything wrong. It's just they couldn't be proven like how loyal they were, So, so that was really tough. So like on December 7th, over 300, sorry, I don't know if you can hear, it's the trash.
No problem.
Oh, loud. But anyway, so over, 300 people were rounded up in Hawaii on December 7th. And and they were prisoners. This was before Executive Order 9066, which called them internees, because that happened on February 19th in 1942, and this is December 7th, 1941. And so it was, it was pretty tough. And so to add insult to injury, they were called prisoners of war. It's like, how can I be a prisoner of war? Like I immigrated to this country. I've been here for like 40 years, and I'm not fighting for the other guy. So yeah, it was very insulting. And then meanwhile, a lot of these guys had sons, who were in the service fighting for America.
Yes, ma'am. So now did the 100th Battalion, when they completed their training, were they amalgamated with the young men who volunteered with the Triple V to become the 442nd, or did the 100th Battalion actually go into combat independently before it became part of the 442nd?
Yes, they did. So they have 9 months of combat on the 442 before the 442 even showed up in the European theater. So the 100, they were at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. And then they went down to Mississippi to train for a bit more before being deployed. And so they landed in, Salerno, Italy. And they were with the 34th Division, the Red Bulls, the National Guard of Iowa. Yeah, and so and then they went, up the boot, and they were really devastated. They're decimated in Monte Cassino, and so that's where they earned their nickname, the Purple Heart Battalion, for just getting wiped out there. So that was in January 44, and then so the 100th was, they were pretty wiped out. So the 442, meanwhile, was training at Camp Shelby, and so they sent replacements, and then they so those replacements became part of the 100 before the 442 showed up. So the 442 arrived in Naples in June of 44, and then they met up in Civitavecchia, and so the 100th became part of the 442 because they were just one battalion, right? And so they were the 100th Battalion, separate because nobody wanted them in the beginning. They were like, oh, we don't want these Japs, but they were such great fighters, that eventually, that they showed Nazis would actually double up their effort when they knew that the 100th was close by. So that was pretty cool to find out later. And so the 442 shows up, in June of 44. And actually, I just posted about this. So the 100th is they become the first battalion of the 440, because there's 3 battalions, right? First,
Yes,
second,
ma'am.
third. And so they were the first battalion, but because they were so decorated already, they were like, we're not 442, we're the 100. And so, that was their identity, right? And
Yes.
they were very proud of wearing the Red Bull insignia on their sleeve, because they earned it, right?
Sure.
So they kept their designation as the 100. So that's why it's called the 100th / 442nd, it's actually the 100th Battalion 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
That's amazing. Now, did the 100th reputation, not saying that the 442nd wouldn't not have go on to do great things anyway, but do you think having that stellar combat reputation spurred the other 2 battalions, like, hey, we have to live up to this, and
Yes,
drove them to higher achievements?
it did. Although, of course, there's that rivalry, and it still existed, to the day the vets. I mean, then there are still some vets alive, right? And they're still now that there are fewer of them, they're realizing they really should be friends. But that rivalry existed. I mean, I saw it, and there are actually 2 different clubhouses in Hawaii. There's Club 100. There's a 442nd, Veterans clubhouse. They're very close to each other. But yeah, I mean, like, so the 100's motto, it was remember Pearl Harbor. So the Army actually wanted to give them the motto, be of good cheer. And they were like, whatever. No way.
No thanks.
Right. So Colonel Turner, Farrant Turner, who they affectionately called him, they called him Old Man Turner. He fought for them, and he was like, if anybody has earned the right to have the motto, remember Pearl Harbor, it's these boys. So that's how they got that, that motto. And then the 442 picked their motto as go for broke, which is the pidgin English gambling term, risk it all to win it all. And and people would say that in Hawaii, if before World War II, it's in like songs and stuff, go for broke. But the 100 didn't like that. They thought it was cocky. And I mean, of course, but yeah, their reputation did precede. It did help the 442 out, because these trucks of Haole soldiers would go by the 442 who had just landed, and they'd be like, hey, one puka puka, because that's what they called the 100. So in Hawaiian, a puka is a hole, and it looks like a 0. So that was their nickname, the one puka puka.
Very cool. And for my audience that does not know much about Hawaiian culture, what precisely is a haole again?
Oh, it's a Caucasian. It's a white person.
No worries. So the 442nd gets to theater in June of 1944. So there's roughly 11 months of combat left before eventually the Germans are going to surrender and VE Day gets celebrated. And over those 11 months, the regiment goes on to do some amazing things in Italy and also southern France. So just if you could recount just some of the highlights of their combat record. I know that they sustained a ridiculous number of casualties. They earned a tremendous amount of valor awards. If you could kind of break that down for us.
Yeah. So they're they are the most highly decorated unit. They have 21 medals of honor. They have 7 presidential unit citations, although there are 8 certificates in the 442 office above the copy machine. So yeah. They have, and this number has been sort of an error. Like some sites will say almost 10,000 Purple Hearts, but that's actually not accurate. It's actually over 4,000 Purple Hearts. The other 5,000, it was like it's non-combat wounds for like trench foot and that sort of thing. Yeah, but
so 4,000 Purple Hearts for a regimental size unit, that's still incredible.
Yeah, it is, right? And yeah, they did some amazing things. Like in fact, they earned 5 of their presidential unit citations in 2 weeks in the Vosges Mountains of France.
That's incredible. I mean, that whole battle does not get enough coverage compared to things like Normandy or Market Garden or the Battle of the Bulge. I can count on one hand the number of books I've seen about the Vosges Mountains and the desperate fighting that took place there. And so that's just amazing. So thank you for like this quick rundown, because I wanted to kind of talk through the combat history real quick so we can start talking about your book and your movie. So
Mm.
what motivated you to start turning these stories into a manga comic originally? And could you share a little bit about what a manga is to some of my folks who might not be familiar with graphic novels?
So a manga it's just basically the Japanese word for comic book or graphic novel. And I started calling it that because, when I at first I started calling it a comic book because that's really what it is. But then people were like, but it's not funny, it's not ha ha funny, it's a comic, it's not a comic book, and it was longer than a regular comic book. So, it's a very thin graphic novel. And so it just turned into this manga because it was just easier to use the Japanese word because I don't know, it just felt easier.
Well, it seems like a little bit too, and I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but the illustrations I've seen, they seem to be
Mm.
inspired by sort of that Japanese cartooning style a little bit more than something you'd see in a Marvel or a DC comic.
Right, right. And so to give you a brief history on that, so they are really cute, like anime style. But the idea was always not to do the comic book first. I always wanted to make a movie, but movies are very difficult and impossible, endeavors, and so they're very expensive. And so it was like the economy had tanked. It was 2008, I think. And I was sitting with my writer, and I was like, man, what are you gonna do if we never get to make this movie? Nobody's got any money. Um, it's not like you can just bind a movie script and people can read it. They don't know how to read a movie script. And then I was like, oh, what if I made a comic book? Because that's basically storyboards, and it's much more bite-sized, right? So I was gonna run these historic photos through like a filter, that made it like a drawing. Um, and I thought, okay, yeah, let's do that. And then I called my friend Jake Shimabukuro, who wrote the soundtrack for my film, because, earlier I had, I've known him since high school. And for those who don't know who Jake Shimabukuro is, he's an ukulele virtuoso. He's played for the Queen of England. It's pretty crazy, like his career, this
That's
guy
amazing.
playing ukulele. Yeah. But I bumped into him, and I don't know, like 2007, we reconnected. And I was like, hey, I'm making this movie about the 442. You want to write my soundtrack? He was like, sure, but of course it's very difficult to write a soundtrack when there's no movie. So when I had the idea for the comic book, he was one of the first people I called. And I was like, yeah, what about this? And he's like, yeah, I love it. Let's do it. I'll play, we'll fundraise, we'll get it done. So that's kind of how that sort of took that side, turn. And I didn't have an artist yet. I was just gonna, I didn't have a budget for art anyway. And then I realized, wait a minute, I don't have all these scenes that I want to, tell. So now what do? Do I get little action figures and take pictures of you know what I mean? So there was a problem. And then I met Damon Wong, who became my artist. And so he's an animator, by trade. Like he's from Hawaii, but he moved, to the mainland to pursue his art. And he was like, well, I can draw it. I can draw really good. And I was like, okay, but so he works for Bob's Burgers, and then that style is not. I was like, hey, whatever. But the style in my mind was a realistic style, you know.
Sure.
And then I thought, oh, but you know what I wanted is so around that time, Plants versus Zombies, that game in Angry Birds, that was really popular, And I thought, this would be so perfect if I could have like a little 442 game, like with really cute characters. So I was like, can you draw me some cute characters and maybe just draw Goro and Eddie? They were my friends. And so he met them. And he was like, okay. So he came up with these sketches and they were like super cute, And I was like, those are so adorable. And then I thought, who the heck has time to make a video game? Like I have to get this comic book done, So these, the characters, they were drawn, but they were put on the side, And then, Damon he was helping me draw the first page. He was like, he's like, oh, I'm gonna be home, on vacation for like a month. We'll just crank it out. We'll do a page a day. So he didn't really know what he was talking about either. He didn't know how much work this is, what he was signing up for.
That's
So
pretty ambitious, actually, a page a day. Holy cow.
yeah, so so we did that, and then it took him like, I think it took him 3 days to do the first page. And I was just like sitting there, just kind of like watching him. It took him like 5 hours to do 3 panels. And I was like, oh my God, we're never gonna get this done. And then of course he was just volunteering to do it. And I kept on getting kicked off by his paying gigs, of course, because so I was like, man, I'm like all this anxiety. I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna go and pound the pavement. I'm gonna fundraise. I'm gonna pay you so that I can actually have some real deadlines, like a real project, so I don't lose my mind. And then so he did the first page, and it was really nice. It was but it was realistic looking. And I showed it to my friend Laurie, and she was like, this is nice, but where's the chibis? And so the chibis, that's what we call them, like, so chibi literally means little, like it's small in Japanese. And so that's the style of drawing, the chibis. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. Like that's what we should use. The chibis, it should be chibi style, because the plan had always been to give half the print run to Hawaii schools and public libraries, but it's a very violent story,
Yes,
and so
ma'am.
I didn't want angry parents calling me, suing me, why did you traumatize my kid, you know what I mean? But I realized that if we did use the chibis, we could tell that, because the story is not about how horrific or gory it was. I didn't want that. It's really it's the human story. But of course, because they were in battle, yeah, I mean, you have to address that. How can you not?
No, exactly.
So yeah, but the chibis really made it, it really made them more accessible for them. Like the kids just really gravitate towards them, like, because it's usually like I have these big cutouts of them, and I would bring them with me, like to Comic-Con and whatever. But they're short, right? They're like half the size of a person, but it's like eye level for a kid. So like I always see the little kids staring, like at the chibis. So it's
Oh, that's awesome. And I got to admit, the chibis were the first thing that caught my attention when I first was learning about your work. And that's how I first realized there was a 34th Infantry Division connection, because one of the chibis has the Red Bull on his
right,
helmet.
the Red
And I'm
Bull,
like, what?
yeah.
And the only thing I knew was that beautiful 442nd patch, red, white, and blue with the Statue of Liberty and all that. But here's the Red Bull guys. I'm like, okay, there's a connection here I don't know about.
Yeah.
So your chibis actually taught me something, and I appreciate
Cool.
it. So I got to ask, before we go a little bit further and start talking about getting the book actually produced and transitioning the movie, what was your background? Or do you have a fine arts background, or like what made you decide I'm going to do a comic and a movie and I'm going to be the most creative person on Oahu? Like what happened here?
I think I'm just sort of crazy. Honestly, like it's such a yeah. So I'm a software engineer. Like that was my job. And then there were these tax credits that came into play while I was a software engineer. And then it was for like all these alternative, like IP industries, like so software. That's how I found out about it. Health, alternative fuel. And then at the last minute, they tacked on film. And so I was like, oh, I know it should be a movie, because I'd seen this play when I was in college about the 100 442. And I was like, wow, that's really neat how, I mean, this is something that happened in history, but, when you see it in art, it becomes a part of you, and then you carry it around, it changes you,
Certainly.
And so it creates a very different sort of empathy, very different from even a documentary, because when you watch a documentary, you're like, wow, that's really interesting. It's something that happened to somebody else, right? Because you're watching somebody else tell their story. But a movie, it's like, it's so intimate, like it's like you're living it with them, right? Because you're like the fly on the wall, and then these people become your friends,
Certainly.
So that's kind of how I got the idea. And just being just naivete, and I was like, oh, how hard can it be? Really,
well, you succeeded. That's awesome. So when did the comic get published? When did it actually come out the first run?
Okay, so let me tell you about this idea. So when
Sure.
I had that idea, it was 2001. So yeah, so it was a long time ago. and I hunted down the playwright, and then eventually we didn't work together, you know, and it was very heartbreaking for me because he was like, I'm going to be very difficult to work with. And I was like, I didn't even know what that meant, you know. And so and so I went through like 3 directors, 3 writers, you know, and then, you know, I had sort of kind of given it up, right? So the comic book, just when I just got the idea for the comic book, to do the comic book, that was end of 2008. And then, so with Jake, we had the fundraiser in 2010. Yeah. Okay. It was at the end of 2009. So we had the fundraiser in 2010. And then that's actually when he wrote the theme song for my movie called Go for Broke. And, you know, but he couldn't really talk about it because it's sort of weird, right? To be like, oh, I wrote this theme song for my friend's movie that isn't made yet. Right. So he would just, and then he would just talk about the vets, and he's like, yeah, this is for them. But it, you know, it really worked out because, so the comic book came out in 2012 in October. And so, you know, I'd been working on this movie thing for like how many years, right? Like 11 years at that point. And, and then the comic book came out, and then it was like this huge like roller coaster because Senator Inouye passed away, like, you know, 2 months after the comic book came out. And so I had a grant from the state of Hawaii to sort of package it. And that was like in 2007. And then the governor at the time let the money lapse. And so I never got the money to do the movie or to package it for, you know, to get it ready to be whatever. And then, so at his funeral, I mean, I saw my legislator friends, and I was like, see, he could have seen something maybe, you know. And they were like, well, you know, we we have a Democrat governor now, because Hawaii is very blue, you know.
Yes, ma'am.
And that started with the 442 because, you know, back in the, well, let's not get into the history of it, but anyway, just to say that, very, very strong Democrat state, and it's because of the 100 and 442, sort of. Anyway, so there, we had a Democrat governor, and the legislators were like, well, we'll just send your grant app through again. We'll rubber stamp it, and then you'll get the money. So I was like, okay, you know, and you better, you know, because it was so much work, right? To
Yes,
put
ma'am.
that together. And I was like, you know, it's so tiring to get your hopes up and then be disappointed again, you know, to drag Eddie around. So Eddie Yamasaki was a 442 vet. He's the only veteran, only 442 vet to go to Punahou and Harvard,
Oh, wow.
like Obama. But, you know, but I'm really like, there, because of racism, you know, like he had 2 Japanese in his class. The other one became a surgeon. And there were like, he said there were 8 Chinese, and the rest were like Hawaiian and Haole, because that was, you know, that's what, anyway. So, but yeah, Punahou is like the prep academy here.
Yes, ma'am.
So yeah, but yeah, so Eddie was a really dear friend. So he's the chibi with the glasses, you know, and he, but yeah, he helped me champion. So if you see in the movie, I gave him the assistant producer credit.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because he really did help me. And then it was super sad because he actually passed away. Like he never saw the finished film, but he had a stroke right after we wrapped principal photography, and so he had moved. Yeah, so he had moved to Japan. After the war, he married a girl from Japan, and so his kids, you know, lived in Japan, well, and elsewhere. So he had moved to live with his daughter. You know, she had invited him to, you know, she was like, I'll take care of you. So, and so he had a stroke and he lost power of speech. But I got on the first flight I could, and I showed him scenes of, you know, of himself in the movie, and then he couldn't talk, but he had his little claw and he would clap.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah.
So, and that must have been a lot of motivation for you, because, you know, the senator's passed away, now Eddie's passed away, and you're trying to make this film. It's to educate a wider audience, but it's also an honor of these men, and you're losing them, you know, every day. So that must have really put some pressure on to try to get this project finished.
Yeah, it sucked, you know, because there was so much that was totally out of my control, you know, and I can't make the legislators vote one way. All I can do is present my case and drag Eddie around, you know, and so that was like right after the senator passed, you know, so he passed away on December 17th, 2012. And so I put in, the grant app in January, and and then the legislature, the session goes through April, and then they had approved it. But then even after that, like the governor has to release the funds, and then they have to vet you, and they're like, oh, can you even do that? And it's like the money was like for $560,000, which doesn't sound like much at all for a film, and it's not. Right? It's nothing for a film, right? I mean, like one episode of Hawaii Five-O was like $4 million, and that's not even counting the marketing for it. Anyway, that's a network. So, so it was very painful, and then at the same time, I'm like, oh my God, this is state taxpayer money, and I was, my stomach was just churning. Like, I don't want to be responsible for state taxpayer money, but it was really more like, well, this story is important to Hawaii, and if Hollywood doesn't care, it doesn't mean that it's not important, so it's important to Hawaii. So and where else in the world can you get like some film students at UH, making a film about their counterparts, on December 7th, nowhere else, like only in Hawaii.
That continuity is amazing. So you've got, these got students who are, a legacy of these, veterans filmed on the location where some of these events happened. I mean, just all that coming together is super powerful. And you answered my next question, because I was going to ask how you got for such a shoestring budget, a small grant, a lot of fundraising, and you guys produce a very professional product.
Thank you.
And so you guys, it was an amazing job. So obviously, did you get any, beyond the film students themselves, did U of H film department give you guys any support?
Well, the students themselves were a huge support, because they were all our PAs. But they actually got responsibility. They weren't just directing traffic or getting coffee. They were actually building the sets. They were helping with costuming. They helped translation. Handle the talent. So they really did get some great experience, as well as all our department heads. Because Hollywood shoots a lot in Hawaii, but most of those department heads, they bring them in because they can't, if they can't trust the local people, right? They don't know, right? And it's a big business. So of course I don't blame them. But, so the people who were department heads on my film, they're not, had nowhere near that kind of responsibility on, network shows or Hollywood films. So that was really neat, to see, because I knew they could do it. It's just, they just need to be given the chance, just like the 442,
Yes, ma'am.
So
how did you recruit your actors?
Oh gosh, well, so having worked on this film for so long, and they're only, like, you can count them on one hand, the Japanese American actors, and not even American, like Peter Shinkoda, who plays Masaji Maramoto, he's Canadian, but Peter has been, in Hollywood pretty much like for 20 years. So he was, he's always a bad guy, right? Because he's Japanese. So he played Genda in Midway. And then he was the bad guy Nobu in Daredevil, on Netflix. So it's like, he's like, when do I get to play the good guy? So, but and Chris Tashima, who has an Oscar. So I met Chris a long time ago too, in 2004, I think. So he had done a short film. So actually he won the Oscar doing portraying Chiune Sugihara, who is like the Japanese Schindler. He was a diplomat in Lithuania, and he wrote like 6,000 exit visas for Jews.
That's amazing.
So
all these threads and connections. That's so cool.
Yeah. And then you're probably not familiar with Hikaida, but in Hawaii, he is huge. He's beloved, and he's like a household name. But that's who I got to play. He's from Japan. He lives in Japan. But that's the actor that I got to play Matsujiro Otani, who is the founder of the fish auction, who was hauled off in his bathrobe.
Yes, ma'am. I found him to be a very powerful character, and now knowing that powerful of an actor portrayed him, that makes so much sense. So was this an opportunity, do you think? I don't want you to put words in these folks' mouths, but I'm assuming they donated a lot of time. You're not really being able to command Hollywood salaries here. So this must have been a passion project for them as well.
Yeah, it really was. And for everyone, and even people who didn't, Hawaii Media Inc., they lent us all well, we rented the gear from them, but it was really, they really gave it to us, you know, like something that would cost, like the grip truck, I'm sure it would have cost like $5,000 a day, but they just charged us $5,000 for the entire production,
Oh,
you
wow.
know.
And how long did the
Yeah.
production last?
Well, the principal photography was 20 shoot days over a month. That was December till January in
That's aggressive.
2017. Yeah. Yep. And but you know, we really so we were very short on cash, but the people of Hawaii are just so generous. You know, like we don't have like money, but like we'll give what we have. So people like restaurants just brought food. They fed our extras. You know, like that the last scene of the film, you know, like there were supposed to be 20,000 people. You know, we can't feed those extras. We could barely afford to clothe them. Like, well, actually, we couldn't afford to clothe them. We could barely afford to clothe the soldiers, you know, because that was, I don't know, I think that was like $10,000 at least just for the dickies. But and we told them to wear their own pants, you know, so the pants, like I just give it away. Everybody's gonna look at the pants.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, but the crowd, you know, we just said, hey, like, and the news outlets helped us a lot too. They were like, hey, if you want to be in a movie, show up in 40s clothing. You know, so that's what they did, you know, and
That's
all the
amazing.
restaurants, like McDonald's, they donated like 500 hamburgers, you know, and to feed our extras. And Roy Yamaguchi, you know, he's a celebrity chef. He made 60 bentos and he brought it down for our cast and crew, like himself, you know. So Roy is very generous. Like, but that's, you know, that's how important it is. This story is to Hawaii, you know. Yeah,
That's
and
awesome.
the camera that we shot with was it belonged to Abraham Williams. You know, he's our former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. That's actually her husband. But you know, I mean, he brought it's an Ari Alexa, and that's what Hollywood shoots with. You know, and he's a very talented camera operator. Yeah.
That's so cool. So how did you get obviously you're talking about all these different donations or people who are giving you things at reduced cost. When you're doing the actual military aspects of it, when you needed uniforms, weapons, equipment, I'm assuming, and if I'm assuming wrong, tell me I'm wrong, but you must have got some reenactors or other types of groups involved for a little technical advice. And could you elaborate on that a little bit?
So I had been from the beginning, I made friends with the reenactors, you know, and their vehicles, and gosh, we would not have been able to make the film without them and their stuff, you know. And it was just kind of not, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but actually it was terrible. It was a terrible idea. So we started filming right after the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And, you know, there was like 10 or 11 days of commemorative events. And I thought that would be a good idea because everybody would be in town. It was a horrible idea because it burned everybody out. Everybody was super tired from everything. Nobody wanted to do anything, you know, the next, you know, like when we started shooting. So I was like, and I was exhausted because I was bringing the veterans to events and whatever, you know, and it was so early. So, so looking back, I'm like, oh, that was the dumbest idea ever. What did I do? But yeah, I mean, those reenactors like Somar Chun, Erica Ko, they brought well, they didn't bring so much gear. I mean, because they do have jobs, like they're dentists and one is a veterinarian, you know, like, so they were still busy. Like they couldn't be on our set. They did show up when they could. Like we did have one shoot day, it was a weekend. And then like, so they were able to drive their own Jeeps around. And so that was pretty cool. But yeah, like all the gear. Oh, and so we shot at Schofield for like a week. That was really cool, you know, and
did you have to do anything special coordination to get access to the installation, like go through the, you know, Army Public Affairs and all that kind of stuff?
Yes. So Raimi Operud, he was the PAO for the 25th, and he was great. And he's actually in the movie. So
oh, cool.
When I was planning, yeah. And so he plays Jack Burns, you know, when they're in the FBI office, you know, and he's like, and he actually, because he does look like Jack Burns. So it's kind of neat. So I wanted, so the VVV lived at Schofield, and then I wanted, you know, to be able to show Ted Tsukiyama, who was alive then, you know, to see if he recognized anything, if he could tell me where anything was. So I called, I don't even know who I called, but, you know, I mean, eventually I got in touch with Raimi, and and I was like, hey, I want to make a movie and I want to shoot at Schofield if you'll let me, and because that's where it actually happened, and can I bring a veteran who lived there, and they're like, yeah. so, so yeah, I mean, and then I brought the comic book. The comic book helped a lot, of course, because like visually, when you talk about a movie, it's like people get excited, but it's so like pie in the sky. They don't really, but if you can show them a book, like, here, I did this, and this is actually historically accurate, then you have some credibility, and
Sure.
like, oh, and by the way, this is Ted, and here he is in the comic book, and here's Eddie, and here he is in the comic book, and so, knowing that these veterans actually helped me with these projects, that of course helped a lot.
No, that's awesome. Now, rewinding a little bit, even before 2001, did you grow up with hearing stories of the 442nd? Was that just like part of your DNA, or like what first kind of spurred interest to even start doing this way back when?
so let me tell you that, yes, I my great uncle, my grandpa's younger brother, was in the original 100th Battalion. So he was in the 298th defending Hawaii on December 7th. So my dad would tell me, when I was a kid, oh, Uncle Ko, he was a hero. He was in the one Puka Puka. They're the most highly decorated. And I'm like, yeah, I don't care. I'm 9. I'm a girl. Ancient history. We don't even see that side of the family hardly. So I really, took it for granted. Like, I think a lot of people in Hawaii, because, when I was a kid, they were still, um, you know, like Governor Ariyoshi, for example, he was military intelligence service, but he was the first Japanese American governor in the United States. And, so me as a kid, I I don't know anything else, right? So of course I'm going to take this for granted. And then even
Certainly.
Patty Takemoto Mink, right? Probably first Asian American Congress. Well, actually, I don't know, probably. But, I mean, I see these people on TV, they're leading our state. So to me, it's like, oh, that's just normal. So I didn't really realize until, and then I didn't notice this either, but it was in high school. So I was like, I was a sophomore, and I wrote some paper about how the 100th and 442nd changed the socioeconomic status of Japanese Americans in Hawaii and the United States. And, I read these books and I forgot about it, of course. And then, so it was really but it, obviously it began to sink in high school. And then in college, when I saw the play, I was like, oh, okay. But, by then it's like, the vets had retired and they were not really in the public eye anymore. So, people forgot, right? And
Right.
then, so I guess by the time I thought, oh, this would be a great movie, I mean, not, and I don't think I had even seen the movie the Van Johnson Go for Broke, which
From
which
back in what, the
actually was,
50s?
yeah, it was 1950, and so they was actually nominated for an Oscar for like best screenplay or something, and it was like the third top grossing movie that year. And so the world premiere was in Hawaii, and there are some of the real vets in it, so that was pretty cool. But like the talking to the vets, working on this project, later on they'd say stuff like, yeah, so the Howley guy gets the girl and we get the pig, so I'm like, oh yeah. I mean, I didn't really notice it, but that is true. It's Hollywood's narrative of who the hero is, right? It's always this white hero.
So did that make you kind of feel like a responsibility to make sure that you told the story accurately and kind of broke away from those Hollywood versions, especially with I don't want to come across like an over gushing fanboy, but like so many heroes come out of that regiment and those stories deserve, I mean, 21 medals of honor. That's ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
you have divisions that
Mhm.
don't have that many. And so
I know, right? Yeah. And so it was kind of annoying to me that, like the Netflix Medal of Honor series that just came out like a
yes,
couple
ma'am.
years ago, not one episode about anybody from the 100 442. I mean, there was one about Hershey Miyamura, who was with the 100, like he was a replacement, but he didn't get his Medal of Honor with the 100. He got it in the Korean War,
Yes,
you
ma'am.
know? So yeah, I was not that happy about that.
Understandable. So since you kind of went from having this, okay, I'm not really listening to what dad's telling me about my great uncle, I wrote this paper, but then you start developing an interest. Did you like go seek out the clubhouses to start meeting these guys?
Oh,
How did you start
well,
establishing these relationships?
So it was really the movie, I was like, oh, let's make a movie, right? It'll be fun. People will learn, it's so, right. Really. but, so that's the first thing I did. I went to the clubhouse and I'm like, hey, what do you guys think? What if we made a movie? And they're like, okay.
Who are you again?
Right. Exactly. I mean, I was young then. I was like 26, and it's like, who's this kid? And we don't, whatever, but well, whatever, good idea. I guess we'll try to help you, like, yeah. So it's kind of funny, and so along the way, it was really the school of hard knocks, because the film school didn't even exist at UH yet,
So when did you guys finally wrap this up and premiere the movie? When did it actually come out?
So we shot in December of 2016, and then we had pickup, like 6 days of pickup. So 3 days in April, and then 2017, and then 3 days in August, which is crazy because we showed the film, the unfinished film, to the veterans in October. So my director, Alex, he was very nervous about it because we didn't have our effects yet either, and so like the Pearl Harbor stuff, and I don't even remember if we used like old Signal Corps or like historic footage. But I mean, the rest of it was there, and the soundtrack was there. And so I told Alex, I was like, you know what, don't even worry about it. Like, it looks, everything else looks great. This one little part it's totally forgivable, and that is what happened. It was, for me, that was the most meaningful, even though the film wasn't finished, to be able to show it to the vets and be like, hey, this is you. Do you see yourself? And yeah.
That's awesome. Now, did you take pains to kind of cast an actor who would look like, well, this is what he kind of looked like when he was a kid. So we got to make sure we get this guy.
I did. And so, so of course the older actors, like Shigeo Yoshida, Peter Shinko, Masaji Maramoto, I knew them already. So I kind of had an idea of who they should be. And then Jake Shimabukuro, who wrote my soundtrack, he had never acted before. In fact, he was trying to get out of it, but I was like, no, the camera loves you. And I'm just going to write the lines I'm going to write for you. It's going to be like, because he goes and he plays for school kids anyway. So I'm like, what you're going to say to these kids is what you already say. So don't worry, but yeah, I mean, it was really nice, like, I guess, to be able to write a script and be like, oh, this is exactly what he said. I'm going to put it in the script, So cool. in many ways, the vets helped write this movie. Yeah.
That's awesome. That is so cool. And so if folks who are watching now or listening to the podcast, they want to actually watch Go for Broke, your Go for Broke, not Van Johnson's, where do they need to go? And if with your permission, I'd like to put a link in the comments. When we get this
yeah, sure. GoForBrokeMovie.com, and then they can rent or buy it. So you can rent it. I think it's like $12 for 3 days, or you can just buy it like forever for like 25 days. Although I'm working on the DVD right now. I mean, I know nobody uses DVD, but you know what? This is my demographic. Like, they're like mostly older people, and so they don't know how to stream anything. So it's a DVD, right? I mean, so they're like, where's the TV? Where's the DVD? And we want to buy the DVD. So I'm trying to like I'm still looking through old footage. Like, this is what we did in 2002. Or here's our fundraiser from 2010. So yeah, but it's hard. So I wanted to do like the making of, like on that same DVD. There's no way. I'm not gonna. I don't have time to do that. It's gonna have to be its own film later. But the little featurette at least can talk about the soundtrack and how that came to be, and how, because it's not your everyday composer who helps you fundraise and do all these things for the veterans, So I thought that was special. And then the other thing is, Eddie, Eddie worked with me on this, and I dragged him to the Capitol and the vets, to Pearl Harbor to do all these book signings with me, I mean, because really, like, I did a lot of book signings, but for me, it's like, no, so if here's a spotlight, I'm going to shine it. Let's shine it on the vets, because they're still alive, and awesome. They're the rock stars. So, and they had fun. They would come out and they would sign books, and it was great.
Very cool. So the DVD is obviously your current project associated with the movie. Are you working on another edition of the book?
Yes. So we're on our third printing now, which is great. So I'm getting that to print right now.
Wow.
But the DVD actually, so Jake, he travels a lot, and so I would see him on the road much more often than at home in Hawaii. And we were talking in LA, and he was like, I was complaining. I was like, there's so much stuff. It's impossible to fit it into just like one movie. Then the movie's gonna be like 5 hours long, And he was like, well, what if it was just like Band of Brothers? You have a series, like a mini series. And I was like, oh, that's a good idea, And so that's actually how Go for Broken origin story started. Like it took that, because before it was supposed to be like the whole epic, like 5 years, right? Time span, but yeah, that was tough. so yeah, I mean, and so the next movie that I'd like to do, that the one that of course everyone wants to see, is the Battle of the Vosges.
Yes, ma'am.
Because that's when they suffered 800 casualties in a month, and they rescued the Lost Battalion of Texas, and so all those things are still there. Like the original foxholes, and the town of Bruyere looks very, pretty much the same.
So have you had the opportunity to go there and walk the ground?
Yeah,
Wow.
and I've been there 3 times. I was fortunate to, and the trip that was most meaningful to me was 2014. So that was the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Bruyere, Bifontaine, and the rescue of the Lost Battalion. Although the people of Bruyere and Bifontaine, they celebrate every year. There's always a ceremony, and there's like monuments for the 100-442. There's Honolulu Street, there's 442 Highway.
Oh wow.
So it's really, yeah, and there are tons of monuments. So it's and yeah, the foxholes are still there. So but Eddie, and so the unit is still active, and they're stationed at Fort Chapter. And and so they get invited by the mayors of these small towns, and they'll they'll ask the vets. They're like, hey, do you guys want to come? We'll help you travel. And they did. It was really great. So like Jack Nakamura, he was with a replacement with 100. Like he had a wheelchair, and they lifted his wheelchair so he could see.
Wow.
They carried it to the foxholes. So
that's amazing. What a tribute.
yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, I've taken too much of your time already, Stacy. You're obviously a very busy person. So I'm going to just say thank you very much for coming on the show today. This has been Ben Powers with the Commander's Voice. My guest has been Stacy Hayashi, who is the writer, creator of the Go for Broken origin story movie and the manga comic that's associated with it. I urge you to check it out. And thank you very much for joining us this morning, ma'am.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.